Upang ipakilala ang ating panauhing tagapagsalita, siya ay kawaksing propesor mula sa Kolehiyo ng Agham Panlipunan ng Universidad ng Pilipinas, Cebu. Siya ang kasalukuyang Pangulo ng All UP Academic Employees Union Cebu at punong patnugot ng Agipo Global South Journal. Siya ang mayakda ng ilang mga artikulong inilathala sa mga lokal at international na dyaryong pang-akademiko tulad ng Police Power in the Philippines in the Time of the Pandemic sa dyaryong Rethinking Marxism. Bigyan natin ng isang masigabong Zoom palakpakan si Dr. Regleto Aldrich D. Imbo. Dr. Imbo, maraming salamat po sa pagpapaunlak sa aming imbitasyon.
Maraming salamat din, Justin, at sa Aperon Group sa ipag-imbita sa akin bilang speaker sa inyong topic ngayong gabi, pambungad sa dialektikong materialismo. Okay, so I'll be speaking in English, okay, because I really don't have the mastery of the Filipino language compared to you guys. So and my apologies. So introduction to dialectical materialism. Basically, to understand what dialectical materialism is, we need to situate it, contextualize it as a component part of Marxism. I think you are already familiar of what Lenin identified as the three component parts of Marxism. So you have first political economy, which basically was influenced by the political economic thinkers from Britain. And then second is scientific socialism, whose origin can be traced in the revolutionary experience or tradition of France, as well as the theories of socialism that were proposed back then by the thinkers, what Marx called as utopian socialism. And then the third component part of Marxism is its philosophy. And the philosophy of Marxism is called as dialectical materialism. So again, what are these three components? So you have political economy, scientific socialism, and philosophy or dialectical materialism. So the term dialectical materialism or DM was not really coined by Marx and Engels themselves, but was coined by their successor, Joseph Dietgen, and was first used by the Marxist Georgy Plekhanov. Succeeding Marxist thinkers were also able to develop the concept, especially considering its importance as in revolutionary practice, as well as a theoretical guide in doing revolution. So among those who developed the concept further were Joseph Stalin, in his work Dialectical and Historical Materialism, published in 1938. And then you also have Mao Zedong on his work On Practice and On Contradiction, published 1937, both in 1937. And then you also have Vladimir Lenin in his work Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. You also have a more contemporary thinker, Louis Althusser, in his work Contradiction and Overdetermination, and on the materialist dialectic, which are chapters of his book For Marx, published in 1965. And even Jose Maria Sison, the Filipino thinker and revolutionary, has recently published articles regarding dialectical materialism. For example, his article titled "A Comment on Dialectical Materialism, Idealism, and Mechanical Materialism," and then a corresponding article, which is actually my interview with Jose Maria Sison, titled "Some Questions on Dialectical Materialism." which are part of his book on the philosophy of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, a season reader series published in 2021. Okay, there are still some philosophers who in one way or another develop the concept of dialectical materialism. For example, you have Alain Badiou, who in a more critical approach uh, proposed a reformulation of the Hegelian Marxist concept of dialectical materialism by forwarding what he calls as affirmative dialectics, where he claims affirmation must be ontologically prior to negation. No, okay. So we'll focus our discussion with Stalin and Mao Zedong, in their works dialectic. In the case of Joseph Stalin, dialectical and historical materialism, and with Mao's on practice and on contradiction. Okay, so let me start. So in Joseph Stalin's dialectical and historical materialism, this book is actually divided into two major discussions, one on dialectical materialism and the other on historical materialism. But I will limit myself on the first part, which tackles the dialectical materialism, or DM. So for Stalin, DM is the world outlook of the proletarian party. So it's basically the notion of DM, according to Stalin, is composed of two concepts. You have dialectical and materialist. So he claims that the dialectical aspect of the concept pertains to the method of Marxists, of the proletarian party, on how to do revolutionary work, on how to also view and understand the world, nature, and history, in the sense that everything is in constant dialectical motion, which we will be discussing also in a bit. And then the materialist aspect of the notion pertains to the theory of DM. So dialectics is or the term dialectics is not an original contribution of Marx and Engels. So centuries before, philosophers were already talking about dialectics. In fact, even the Greeks were using that to mean discourse or debate. So in ancient times, dialectics referred to the art of arriving at the truth by disclosing the contradictions in the argument of an opponent and overcoming these contradictions. And then you might have been able to read the works of Plato, for example, and this is very much this notion of debate or discourse, or the dialectical method of question and answers is very obvious in Plato's dialogues. And then the modern philosopher Hegel also systematically developed dialectics through the notion of Aufhebung, which basically refers to the self-development of mind or spirit. However, for Stalin, Hegel's contribution was limited because it was his notion of dialectics pertained to the self-development of mind or spirit, and therefore idealist. So what Marx and Engels did basically was to take from the Hegelian dialectics only its quote-unquote rational kernel, casting aside its Hegelian the Hegelian idealistic shell, and develop dialectics further to lend it a scientific form. So basically, Marx and Engels basically, as Marx would also claim, inverted Hegel to place dialectics on a more materialist basis. Okay. Now, materialism, the materialist aspect of DM is usually referred to Ludwig Feuerbach. Okay. Um, However, Marx and Engels' materialism is not identical with Feuerbach. And in fact, Feuerbach objected the use of the term materialism. And as Stalin quoted Engels, Engels said, in spite of the materialist foundation, Feuerbach remained bound by the traditional idealist fetters. And that the real idealism of Feuerbach becomes evident as soon as we come to his philosophy of religion and ethics. Okay, so what are the principal features of both the materialist and the dialectical and the materialist aspects of DM? So let's start first with uh, with dialectics. So what are the principal features of the Marxist dialectical method? So there are four main aspects of or features of dialectical method. So one, or the first is nature is connected and determined. So dialectical materialism sees everything in nature, in the world, as connected and not isolated from each other. No, the appearance of independence uh, somehow only refers to the phenomenal aspect of reality, because in truth, reality is connected and not only connected, but they're also determined in the sense that the identity of one thing or one object is influenced by or determined by the others, or so that each thing becomes a part, no, of a greater whole or of a totality. So let me quote Stalin in this. So he said that the dialectical method therefore holds that no phenomenon in nature can be understood if taken by itself, isolated from surrounding phenomena, inasmuch as any phenomena in any realm of nature may become meaningless to us if it is not considered in connection with the surrounding conditions, divorced from them. Then the second feature of the Marxist dialectical method is that nature is a state of continuous motion and change. So the very things, no, that exist do not exist in permanence, but rather are subjected to the constant process of change and motion. So the dialectical method requires that phenomena should be considered not only from the standpoint of their interconnection or interdependence, but also from the standpoint of their movement. They're always in a ceaseless process of motion, in their change and their development. They're coming into being and they're coming out of being. Okay. And then the third feature is natural quantitative change leads to qualitative change. So what we term as change basically is the development of a thing when it has accumulated enough quantitative or it has accumulated enough quantities, no, so that it would take a fundamental leap and would reach the level of development wherein it basically changes its essence, no, or its identity. So development takes place from insignificant and imperceptible quantitative changes to open fundamental changes or to qualitative changes. So in this regard, development does not occur accidentally, but as the natural result of an accumulation of imperceptible and gradual quantitative changes. So in this regard, the dialectical materialism forwards an understanding of development that is not circular, that is not a movement in a circle, nor a simple repetition, but rather a movement that is onward and upward movement, basically a progressive movement or a progressive understanding of movement. Stalin gave some examples on this. For in physics, he has he mentioned about water. When water reaches or when the quantity of its temperature reaches critical point, then water transforms to either steam or vapor or ice. So in this regard, qualitative change takes place only after a certain quantitative leap or a certain quantitative amount has been accumulated that would lead to the qualitative development of the thing concerned. Okay. Then the fourth feature of the Marxist dialectical method is contradictions are inherent in nature. So take note of the term inherent. All of nature are in constant contradiction, and that these contradictions are not external contradictions but rather internal. So in each thing, according to Stalin, there is always the negative and the positive side. There's always in the thing its past and its future. There's always in a thing something dying away and something developing. And this basically allows the thing to its contradiction allows it to develop into a further stage of development. So this to be something driven by internal contradictions, not by an external force, but of an object or a society. So he quotes Stalin here, quotes Lenin, who said that, so basically dialectics, the concept of dialectics for Stalin is opposed to metaphysics, because metaphysics, against the four features that we have discussed concerning the Marxist dialectical method, metaphysics understands nature to be accidental, merely an agglomeration of things, unconnected, isolated from, and independent of each other. And then aside from that, metaphysics also understands nature as a state of rest. The reality, or that which is real, is in the state of permanence. The real is immutable. It is always eternal. It's always in the state of immobility, stagnation, and immutability. And then against dialectics, metaphysics understands development as a simple process of growth, basically just a change in quantity and not of quality. And by arguing this way, metaphysics does not really accept fundamental changes in things, in the sense that things change in their identity or in their essence, especially when it has reached a critical point, or when it has already accumulated enough quantities for it to change. And lastly, against dialectics, metaphysics understands that things are free from contradictions. Of course, its basic understanding is that a thing cannot be and not be at the same time. So metaphysics does not allow the contradiction of things. So what are the implications of this Marxist dialectical method? I'll quote Stalin, who said that if there are no isolated phenomena in the world, if all phenomena are interconnected and interdependent, then it is clear that every social system and every social movement in history must be evaluated not from the standpoint of eternal justice or some other preconceived idea, as is not infrequently done by historians, but from the standpoint of the conditions which gave rise to the system or that social movement and with which they are connected. So dialectical materialism, especially its dialectical aspect, allows us to or challenges us to understand things, history, society, not from the perspective of some preconceived notions, but from the very conditions that gave rise to the systems that are existing in society. So we have to investigate the material conditions that are the determining factors for the development of things. And then uh, aside from this, another implication, according to Stalin, is that it is clear that there can be no immutable social systems, no eternal principles of private property and exploitation, no eternal ideas of the subjugation of the peasant to the landlord, of the worker to the capitalist. So the dialectical aspect of DM demolishes the concept that which was common, for example, during Marx's time, that capitalism is eternal, that it is basically the summit of history, a position that is rather echoed by some liberal thinkers today, that the capitalism, for example, is the end of history, that there is no more, no other system, after capitalism and liberal democracy. So basically, DM teaches us that that things, history, society is always in the constant process of development. Okay, so let me go now to the principal features of Marxist philosophical materialism. So Stalin underscores three features of the Marxist philosophical materialism. The first is that the world is by its very nature material. So what do we mean by this? That the multifold phenomena of the world constitutes different form of matter in motion. And that the interconnection and interdependence of phenomena are a law of developing matter. And lastly, that the world develops in accordance with the laws of movement of the matter. So this basically suggests that the world is made up of matter, and that this matter is always in constant motion and not isolated from each other. And in fact, their interconnection is the basis from which laws can be drawn up and grasped, so that we could understand how things work, or the nature of things and how they develop. Second feature is that nature is an objective reality existing outside and independent of our consciousness. So in this basically this feature of philosophical materialism refutes many positions in the past. For example, you might be familiar with Berkeley, who asserted that to be is to be perceived, as percipi. Basically, Berkeley is in Lenin's work, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Lenin argued or refuted the claims of Berkeley, or at least the advocates of Berkeley, the Machists, because for Berkeley, the things that we see, or what we call, for example, as an apple, is not really a thing in itself, but rather a mere congregation of ideas, or collection of ideas, or a collection of sensations. So for Berkeley, sensations and things are actually identical, and that we can there is really no such thing as a substance, or a thing or matter that exists outside of our senses. So basically, what we call as things, what we call as an apple, is basically the collection of our perceptions about the apple, and there is really no, if you take away all those perceptions, the texture, the sight, the smell, and so on and so forth, there is no apple as a thing that lingers. And in this case, there is no thing that exists independently and objectively outside of consciousness. So um, Stalin quotes Marx, who said, the question of the relation of thinking to being, the relation of spirit to nature, is the paramount question of the whole of philosophy. The answers which the philosophers gave to this question split them into two great camps. Those who asserted the primacy of spirit to nature comprised the camp of idealism. The others who regarded nature as primary belonged to the various schools of materialism. Sorry, it's not Marx that was quoted, it's Engels. So here Engels draws the line between the idealists and the materialists, and they basically are distinguished from each other according to how, or to what they believe is of ontological priority. So for the idealists, it's spirit or geist or mind that's prior to, and even determinant of matter. On the other hand, materialists argue that it's not matter. It's not spirit, but it's actually matter, and that spirit or consciousness is but a reflection only of how do you call this one, of matter. And Stalin also quotes Lenin, who says that materialism in general recognizes objectively real being or matter as independent of consciousness, sensation, experience. Consciousness is only the reflection of being, at best an approximately true reflection of it. Okay. Then Sison, in the work that I mentioned to you earlier, the philosophy of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, I think that's the second of the Sison Reader series, even highlights that consciousness basically, or the conscious human subject only developed lately. And prior to the development of human consciousness, the world was already existing like for millions of years. And this only attests to the materialist position that a matter comes prior to consciousness, or spirit. And in fact, consciousness is only but a reflection of the objectively and independently existing matter. The third feature and the last is that the world and its laws are fully knowable. So our knowledge of the laws of nature, tested by experiment and practice, is authentic knowledge having the validity of objective truth. So the materialist aspect of DM holds that there are no things that are unknowable, or the Kantian thing in itself. So this thing in itself, according to Stalin, is only a moment of the entire process where things are yet unknowable, but through time and advancements, for example, in knowledge and technology, these things could actually be known, and that their supposed character of being things themselves would cease to be. So in this case, they're not really absolutely unknowable or things in themselves, but are rather moments in which knowledge is yet unable to grasp it, or to grasp their nature. But that doesn't mean that they won't be known, because later, as knowledge progresses, they will be understood. They will be known. So for Stalin, materialism is opposed to idealism, because idealism regards the world as an embodiment of an absolute spirit, or an absolute idea, or universal spirit consciousness. So idealism holds that the world basically is the the realization, of the self-developed mind. And then materialism is opposed to idealism, because idealism also asserts that only our consciousness really exists, that the world exists only in our consciousness. Okay? And lastly, that idealism denies the possibility of knowing the world and its laws. Okay. So what are the implications of the materialist Marxist philosophy? So through DM, the history of society ceases to be an agglomeration of accidents, and in this case, development in society are not to be understood as accidental events, no, or yeah, the Baduyan event, for example, no? But rather these are developments that are determined by the laws that govern the development of things, so that there is really no accidental, there is really no evental feature of the development of society, but are all rather governed, no, by absolute laws. And that also through materialism, the study of history becomes a science, no? Because there are laws, and if we are able to grasp these laws, then we are able to be more scientific, to be more objective with our understanding of the world. So this science, no, can be as precise as the other sciences, especially in the natural sciences. And in this case, socialism, no, is converted from a dream of a better future to a socialism that is founded on more scientific grounds, no, or more scientific principles. That's why the Marxist notion of socialism is distinguished from utopian socialism, because Marxists always hold that their version of socialism is anchored on a scientific understanding of how capital works, you know, and also of how the subjective dimension, no, for example, of the revolutionary process ought to be organized, mobilized, no, how the party ought to be or what the role of the party is in the process, no? So the subjective dimension as well has been put into to the scientific study of socialism. Okay, so if dialectical materialism holds that nature is primary and then consciousness is secondary or simply a derivative, or that the objective world is existing independently and then consciousness is but a reflection of the subjective world, then material life of society is primary and the spiritual life is secondary. So this basically suggests that the spiritual, no, or the cultural dimensions of our social existence are but reflections, no, of the more fundamental material elements of our existence. So Stalin said that the source of formation of the spiritual life of society, the origin of social ideas, social theories, political views, and political institutions should not be sought for in the ideas, the theories, views, and political institutions themselves, but in the conditions of the material life of society, in social being, of which these ideas, theories, views are the reflection. This basically echoes, no, a more fundamental assertion of Marx in the German ideology, when he said that it's not consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. So So I think I'll end the discussion there on Stalin's dialectical materialism and historical materialism, and I'll move now to Mao Zedong's on practice and on contradiction. Let me just check the time. Okay. So the work on practice, as I've mentioned, was published in July 1937. So this was prior to the national victory of the New Democratic Revolution in China, which took place in 1949. So on practice was a speech delivered by Mao to basically counter the erroneous notions of some elements of the Chinese Communist Party, you know, what Mao called as the dogmatists and the empiricists. You know? So basically, the dogmatists belittle, you know, the dogmatists belittle practice, you know, in favor of theory. On the other hand, empiricists belittle theory in favor of practice. So the work on practice was written for the dogmatists and empiricists, no, to expose their subjectivist errors. No. But this work is especially written for the error of dogmatism, because basically for Mao, dogmatism is more harmful, you know, in the party compared to empiricism, because of course they do not anymore do practice, because they only hold the reality or the importance, the significance of theory. So Mao begins by regarding how production is an important and in fact the fundamental practical human activity. So it is for him the determinant of all the other activities. So it is through production that we are able to understand the nature of things, that we are able to also recognize, you know, understand the relations of human beings. You know? And most importantly, it is through production that we understand that we can change basically nature into something else. You know? So, however, the social practice of the human being is not confined to social production alone, according to Mao, but also includes, or takes many forms. This includes class struggle, political life, scientific and artistic pursuits, you know, and many others. So of these types of social practice, class struggle exerts a profound influence on the development of human knowledge. Every kind of thinking, without exception, is stamped with because of class struggle. So this work, you know, on practice, as I mentioned, talks about the importance of refutes the problem, the subjectivist error that is especially raised by the dogmatists. Because again, they belittle practice. So Marx again tries to tell us the importance of practice. No? That's why it's also entitled On Practice. And in this work, he situates knowledge, you know, as being determined by practice. So the knowledge for Mao Zedong has different stages. So there are 3 stages of the development of knowledge. And the first of these stages is what he calls as perceptual knowledge. So this is the knowledge that is gained through direct perception of the objective world. So in this knowledge, what we do have are the phenomenal side of reality. They're separate aspects. We simply have we perceive reality, but we perceive perceive them as isolated aspects, no? Isolated from each other. So that's the first stage of knowledge. Then knowledge would lead to the second stage, which he calls as logical or rational knowledge. So there's this leap. So in this leap, concepts are already formed. So what are concepts? So for Mao, concepts are those that enable us to understand the interconnection of things. That we don't take things already as isolated objects, but are rather part, again, of a greater whole. So here, concepts are no longer the phenomena or the separate aspects and the external relations of things. They concepts already grasp the essence of things, the totality and the internal relations of things. So for Mao, between concepts and sense perceptions, there is not only a quantitative but also a qualitative difference. So by means of judgment and inference, one is able to draw logical conclusions out from the knowledge gathered from rational knowledge. We cannot make yet a conclusion, or we can make yet conclusions from perceptual knowledge, because of course the knowledge that we do have is limited, and in fact partial and also isolated. So for Mao, if you make judgments based on this limited data, then you will be most probably you would end up making wrong conclusions. Okay. The examples actually that Mao gave in this book are examples from their own revolutionary practice. No, when, for example, you go to a place, where revolutionaries investigate the area. Sometimes what they do have, what they gather are separate and isolated data from the narratives of the people living in the area. So what must be done is to gather this, then evaluate the data concerned by understanding the interconnectedness or the interrelation between one narrative or one data to another, so that revolutionaries would be able to how do you call this one? Create, or formulate a relevant program or plan of action for that particular area. Okay, so the real task of knowing is through perception to arrive at thought, to arrive step by step at the comprehension of the internal contradictions of objective things, of their laws, and of the internal relations between the process and another, to arrive at logical knowledge. So logical knowledge or rational knowledge differs from perceptual knowledge in that perceptual knowledge pertains to the separate aspects, the phenomena and the external relations of things. Logical knowledge, on the other hand, takes a big stride forward to reach the totality, the essence, and the internal relations of things, and discloses the inner contradictions and the surrounding world. In this regard, logical knowledge is capable of grasping the development of the surrounding world in its totality, in the internal relations of all its aspects. So Mao emphasizes that knowledge, while derived from experience, derived from our perceptions, must not remain in the level of perceptual knowledge. It must be advanced further so that it would reach rational knowledge. And he says that this basically opposes the view of some thinkers, especially the rationalist, in the rationalist tradition, who denies the importance of experience as the basis of knowledge. Now, rational, how do you call this one? Perceptual knowledge must also move or advance further, so that it would be able to understand things again, not from their accidental features, as if they are separated or isolated from each other, but rather so that through rational knowledge we will be able to understand the reality of things in its totality, in their contradictions. Okay. So this theory of knowledge also opposes the empiricist tradition, because for the empiricists, of course, they deny any or they deny the value of reason in the development of knowledge. But the dialectical method, dialectical materialist theory of knowledge suggests that it's not enough that we have perceptual knowledge, because we have to raise it further towards the rational stage of knowledge, where we are already able to understand the essences of things. Okay. So in this regard, knowledge, as I mentioned, must not remain in the perceptual level. It must instead be deepened, and it must be raised further. And this basically reflects the dialectical aspect of the theory of knowledge. Dialectical because it is a process of constant development from the perceptual to the logical. Then the materialist aspect of this theory of knowledge basically refers to the priority of experience in the formation of knowledge. So that we could not really arrive at knowledge or truth if we divorce ourselves from the empirical world. So we have to engage the empirical world. We have to investigate the empirical world so that we will be able to arrive at perceptual knowledge, which will be raised or advanced further to rational knowledge. Okay. So rational knowledge depends upon perceptual knowledge, and perceptual knowledge remains to be developed into rational knowledge. Okay, so basically, this is the dialectical materialist theory of knowledge. So is the rational knowledge the endpoint of the development of knowledge? Mao would say, no, it's not yet the end, because from experience to reason, this from practice to theory must be applied again into practice. Okay, so Marxist philosophy always holds that the most important problem does not lie in understanding the laws of the objective world and thus be able to explain it, but in applying knowledge, applying theory to actively change the world. That's basically the message of the 11th thesis of Marx and Feuerbach, that philosophy has interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. So by the time that we have already reached perceptual knowledge, we must translate this knowledge or this theory and apply this into practice. And only by then, according to Mao, would we be able to know if our theories are correct. Because the ultimate criterion for evaluating whether our theories are correct or wrong is practice. That's why the Maoist or Maoism always holds the priority of practice over theory. Not only because it is through practice that knowledge is derived, but that it's also practice that evaluates, that judges whether theory is correct or not. So if theory is correct, no, if theory corresponds to, if theory corresponds to the objective world, the development of the objective world, then of course the theory is correct. If it does not, then it's wrong. But Mao says that most likely, especially when one at the beginning phase of doing like revolutionary work, most likely theory would not be completely correct. No, so there are still some parts of it that remain to be rectified, so that how do you call this one? Later theory would be would correspond already to the objective world. Okay. Okay, so I guess that I'll end the discussion on practice and proceed to the last work, that we'll discuss this evening, Mao's on Contradiction, which is published in the same year as with on practice, so on contradiction. So basically, in this work, Mao discussed 6 what do you call this one? Aspects. No, we might say aspects of contradiction. Okay, so the first is the two world outlooks. Okay, so here Mao refers to the metaphysical and the materialist or the dialectical materialist world outlook. So the metaphysical world outlook sees things as isolated, static, and one-sided. So it regards all things in the universe, their forms and their species, as eternally isolated from one another and immutable. On the other hand, the dialectical materialist world outlook holds that in order to understand the development of things, we should study the internal contradictions of things, because the development of things should be seen as the internal contradictions and the necessary self-movement of that thing. Okay. So I'd like to quote a text here from Mao, who said that according to materialist dialectics, changes in nature are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in nature. So changes in society are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in society. That is, the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, the contradiction between classes, and the contradiction between the old and the new. It is the development of these contradictions that pushes society forward and gives the impetus for the supersession of the old society by the new. So in this regard, for change to take place, in a given social formation, then its contradictions, its internal contradictions, have to be resolved in order to produce a newer or a higher stage of development, which would still manifest some forms of contradictions, but this time new forms of contradictions, which still would need to be addressed for it to develop further into a higher stage of development, and so on and so forth. So while the internal is decisive, internal contradictions are the more decisive conditions for the development or transformation of a thing or society. External causes are what? Conditions, for change. So in this case, external causes are conditions, while internal causes are the basis for change. So for Mao, external causes become operative only through internal causes. Okay. Then the second is the universality of contradiction. So basically, Mao here suggests that all of nature, all of things are in contradiction. So as the term suggests, universality, there is no object existing in the world that is not currently, in contradiction. So okay, so the universality or absoluteness of contradiction for Mao has twofold meaning. Okay, so first is that contradiction exists in the process of development of all things. Okay, and then second is that in the process of development of things, a movement of opposite exists, from beginning to end. So this movement of opposites is basically the transformation of the object towards its opposite, or towards its other, from the mango seed to a tree, from a toddler to an adult. And then for Mao, basically this is the unity of opposites that characterize contradiction. Okay. In another work, in Talks, it's not actually Talks, I forgot. Talk on Questions of Philosophy. Mao Zedong actually denies that there are three aspects of the contradiction, because Engels mentioned, that there are three aspects. So there is the unity of opposites, negation of negation, and quantitative change to quantitative change change results to qualitative change. Mao Zedong denies the two and only holds the unity of opposites. So basically, this unity of opposites characterizes all of reality. So if you observe basically the world around you, the environment around you, everything is actually turning towards its opposite, towards its other. And that only means that that contradiction is universal. Okay. Now, while contradiction is universal, the second aspect, this contradiction, however, resides in particular situations. So this is the third aspect of contradiction, the particularity of contradiction. In the particularity of contradiction, Mao suggests that things in their things actually have their own identities, their own individual essences, because of the particularities of contradictions that inhere in them. So why, for example, we'll be able to distinguish one thing from another is because of the difference of the contradictions that are taking place in those things. So we can distinguish, for example, or as Mao Zedong gave an example here, they were able to distinguish the character of the revolution in China from that of Russia because of the distinct contradictions that characterized Chinese society back then as a semi-feudal and semi-colonial country. And because of the proper understanding of the distinct features of Chinese society back then, the unique contradictions that characterized Chinese society back then, the Chinese Communist Party was able to draw out or formulate correct and relevant policies concerning their revolution. So this is also where, for Mao, dogmatists err, because for Mao, these dogmatists do not understand that Marxists have to study the particularity of contradiction and know the particular essence of individual things before Marxists can actually adequately know the universality of contradiction and the common essence of things. Okay, so in the Philippines, for example, there are some Marxists, who would simply and mechanically replicate the kind of revolution that the Bolsheviks did in Russia, and would apply it here in the Philippines, as if there's actually no difference in terms of the contradictions that characterize Philippine society. No? So this is another form of dogmatism. And then Mao continues that dogmatists also err in this regard because they do not understand that after knowing the common essence of things, Marxists must go further and study the concrete things and that have not yet been thoroughly studied or have only just emerged. So that's why what's important, according to Mao, is what Lenin said, that we have to study, we have to investigate the concrete conditions, or the concrete analysis of concrete conditions. Okay. Now, to be able to grasp the particularity of contradictions is to be able to correctly formulate the methods to resolve the different contradictions that characterize things. Because the failure to understand the distinct contradictions that inhere in that thing would certainly lead to an erroneous solution to the problem. So this again is another dogmatist error according to Mao. So the dogmatists do not observe the important principle that we have to do concrete analysis of concrete conditions to be able to formulate the most correct methods of resolving contradictions. So they do not understand that conditions differ in different kinds of revolution, and so do not understand that different methods should be used to resolve different contradictions. Okay. So that's for the third aspect. I'll proceed to the fourth, which is the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. Okay, so principal contradiction, and then the principal aspect of a contradiction. So Mao believes that in a thing, in a social formation, in a society, there are many contradictions in the process of their development. Basically, Mao believes that a thing is complex, is originally complex, not simple. So that there are multiple number of contradictions that take place in that thing or in that society. So in this case, one of the contradictions must necessarily be the principal contradiction. And this principal contradiction, its existence and development determines or influences the existence and development of the other contradictions. So what's important, according to Mao, is for Marxists to be able to identify this principal contradiction, so that again, Marxists would be able to formulate a correct policy. The example that he gave here is that when, for example, a semi-colony is invaded with an imperialist aggressor, the classes within that society can temporarily unite in a national war against imperialism. This is actually what the Chinese did when the Japanese imperialists invaded them, at the course of their national democratic revolution. So what Mao Zedong did was to forge an alliance with the Kuomintang government and fought side by side with them against the Japanese aggressors. So in this regard, for Mao, the principal contradiction is not actually between if the conditions is that an imperialist nation is invading a semi-colony, the principal contradiction is not actually between the revolutionary group movement against the government, or the bourgeoisie, but rather all of the people, the classes existing in that society against the imperialist aggressor. So in this case, the principal contradiction is not static, but may take various forms depending on the circumstances. So we might also set as another example what actually is done today, for example, with by the Makabayan group or Makabayan bloc, when it forges an alliance with Lenny Kiko, because basically, of course, this group, the Lenny Kiko group, is also how do you call this one, has with them or in their group, people who are coming from the landed class or big businesses, which supposedly are the 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 main kanang, how do you call this one, opponents of the working people, the peasants, and the proletariat, the working class. But what the Makabayan did is to put into practice this principle of the principal contradiction by identifying the Marcos Duterte alliance as the principal contradiction, and that because this is the principal contradiction, a unity must be forged with the other democratic forces in society so as to frustrate the rise of the Marcoses and the Dutertes, or the return of Marcos in Malacanang. Okay. So at every stage in the development of a process, there is only one principal contradiction which plays the leading role. So this one principal contradiction has to be properly identified so as to be able, again, to formulate correct, relevant policies or plans and programs. Then, in that principal contradiction, there are two aspects that are contending. So there is the principal and the secondary aspect. So the principal aspect of the principal contradiction is the one playing the leading role in the contradiction. So the nature of a thing is determined mainly by the principal aspect of a contradiction, the aspect which has gained the dominant position. So if we take again, for example, the Chinese experience back then when they waged a national war against Japan or the Japanese aggressors. So the principal contradiction there is between the Chinese people and the Japanese imperialists. But because of the superiority of the Japanese forces in terms of military strength, economy, then the Japanese forces would be identified as the principal aspect of the principal contradiction, and the Chinese people as the secondary aspect of the principal contradiction. However, Mao argues that since there is the unity of opposites and things would always turn to their opposites, this does not mean that the principal aspect is absolutely and eternally principal, because as things progress or develop, the principal could this time become the secondary, and the secondary principal, as what actually happened during the Chinese Revolution, especially when the Chinese Revolution or the Chinese people were able to win their national war against the Japanese. So after that contradiction has been resolved, of course, this leads to another contradiction, or basically there is a new principal contradiction that needs again to be resolved. And that's this time the contradiction between the proletariat and the Chinese bourgeoisie, big bourgeoisies and landlords. So basically, the things have changed, and when we say things have changed, the contradictions have already changed. Okay. So again, the situation is not static. The principal could become secondary, and the secondary could become principal. And basically, this refers to the dialectical principle of unity, of the Maoist principle of unity of opposites. Okay. And then the fifth is the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction. So we have mentioned earlier that there are aspects in a contradiction. Now, these aspects exist, or the existence of these aspects of a contradiction in the process of the development of a thing presuppose the existence of the other aspect. So, in the case of the Japanese imperialists, their existence actually presuppose the existence of what a nationalist movement, that wages a war against them, and then the nationalist movement that wages a war against imperialist aggressors also presuppose the imperialists themselves. So again, aspects do not exist isolated from each other or independent from each other, but rather they co-determine, or that they presuppose each other. So these aspects coexist in a single entity. And then, given conditions, each of the two contradictory aspects again transforms itself into their opposite. So for Mao, no contradictory aspect can exist in isolation. So there is life. Without life, there would be no death. Without death, there would be no life. Without above, there would be no below. Without below, there would be no above. Without landlords, there would be no tenant peasants, and without tenant peasants, there would be no landlords. Basically, aspects exist as co-determinant, or they presuppose their opposite or their other. Under given conditions, these aspects would transform into their opposites. So take note of the qualifier, under given conditions, because if the conditions are not actually present, then the transformation would not possibly take place. And this basically is the materialist basis for the development of things. So it is this notion of the presupposition of one with the other, that things, or that contradiction or the contradictory aspects are called identical. So you have here the identity of the aspects of a contradiction. So how then can they be identical? Because, as Mao said, each is the condition for the other's existence. Each is the condition for the other's existence. So, while they are the condition of each other's existence, they would also turn into their other, to their opposite. Basically, that's the law of the unity of opposites. While there is identity, while there is unity, for Mao, unity is only relative, because the appearance of equilibrium, or the appearance of identity, is only temporary. It's relative. What is rather absolute is struggle. So you have there, I don't know if you've heard the line, unity is relative, struggle is absolute. And that's basically the assertion that things are that aspects determine each other, and that when these aspects would turn towards each other, it would reach a point of identity, or unity, where there's a seeming stasis of things, as if there is actually no change that is taking place at all. But for Mao, this is only temporary. It's only relative. Unity is relative. Because later on, this would lead to another phase, a fundamental change, which would this time change the nature and essence of the thing. So struggle again would follow, making struggle an absolute reality in contradiction. Okay, and then the sixth, is the place of antagonism in contradiction. So in another work, Mao actually clarifies that not all contradictions are antagonistic. So for example, the antagonistic between people, um, could be resolved in non-antagonistic solutions, in peaceful solutions. But the contradiction between a despotic landlord that uses the reactionary forces against the peasants, for Mao, is an antagonistic contradiction. So the question of the struggle of opposites includes the question of what is antagonism. For Mao, antagonism is one form, but not the only form of the struggle of opposites. So what does that mean? So armed struggle, for example, is an antagonistic form of resolution. And for Mao, this is a form of resolution, but not the only form of the resolution of contradictions. Because there are still other forms, peaceful forms, dialogical forms that that are required in different, in a non-antagonistic contradiction. As I've stated, the contradiction between people or among people for Mao is not actually antagonistic. So this is actually, Mao actually tries to refute the Stalinist error of purging kulaks, because here Stalin, instead of treating the the contradiction among people in non-antagonistic manner, he rather resorted to antagonism, or antagonistic resolution, resulting, of course, to the murder, the purging of the rich peasants in Russia. Okay, so basically that's the six aspects of the contradiction according to Mao, and I'll end my discussion here. I was already talking beyond 1 hour. I was only given 1 hour. So thank you very much for listening to my talk.
Maraming salamat po, Sir Rex. Na-appreciate po namin yung lecture. Ang dami naming natutunan as usual. Very valuable po. And ngayon pa lang, marami na rin pong questions na nandito. So, diretso na po tayo sa open forum. Again, yung mga gusto pong magtanong, pwedeng ilapag na lang sa chat or magtaas ng kamay, tapos hintayin na lang natawagin namin o di kaya i-message na sa amin privately. So, sir, yung una pong tanong ay, yung general nating perception of dialectical materialism is antagonistic to metaphysics, as you mentioned earlier. But is dialectical materialism not also a metaphysical claim in a certain sense? Salamat po.
Yeah. Well, Marxists would say no to that question, because dialectical materialism is a conscious effort to distance itself from metaphysical ways of understanding the world, especially that metaphysics has been used as an ideological weapon to justify the status quo, existing conditions, as eternal, immutable, unchanging. And so actually I failed to mention this, but Mao mentioned that there are actually two characters of dialectical materialism. It's class character and its practicability. So you say class character, dialectical materialism is always in the service of the movement of the proletariat. And of course, the practical aspect refers to dialectical materialism being a guide in doing revolutionary work. So in this case, it is, for me, it's wrong to identify dialectical materialism as another form of metaphysics, especially if we understand metaphysics as assuming a class character that justifies, no, or that defends the existing state of affairs.
Thank you po. Meron na po tayong nagtataas ng kamay, si Mix Nat. So, pwede po kayong mag-unmute para sa inyong tanong.
Hello po. Sorry po, sira po yung camera ng phone ko. Pero ano na lang po, magsalita na. Good evening po, Sir Imbong. My name is Nat Natrajan Kalin from Adamson University. With relation po sa contradiction, since as we all know, and mostly Marxists, contradiction is the product of a certain epoch wherein, let's say, the industrialization gave birth to the idea that most of the oppression was due to the class society. Now, my question po is, with regards po sa recent or sa current political climate natin, which is ngayon nangyayari na election, can we at least, or is the post-EDSA itself is a manifestation of a contradiction, since yung specter ni Marcos Senior, which is si Bongbong, is bumalik, and I think siya din sa produkto, along with Duterte himself, yung produkto ng field aspirations ng post-EDSA. So can we consider the re-emergence of these individuals as a contradiction itself? Yun lang po. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll have to say that EDSA itself has not fully successfully resolved the contradictions that were present, during that time. It has not fully resolved the contradictions, for example, between the landed class and the peasants, especially given that the post-EDSA regimes are still dominated by the same classes as the ones that also dominated during the martial law period. So as they say, there is actually nothing new that took place post-EDSA, except of course the toppling of the dictator and the restoration of democracy. But other than that, the old forms of oppression and exploitation were integrated into the liberal democratic space that post-EDSA provided. But did this resolve the contradictions? I guess no. It only gave it a human form, as they say, capitalism with a human face, but not really fully and successfully resolved it. And so this failure would naturally or at least would give the conditions for the rise of people who would take advantage of this failure, such as Marcos and Duterte. Their narratives, what actually makes their narratives common is their displeasure, or their discontent with regards the legacies of the EDSA. And well, partly they are correct, because again, as I've said, there is a failure, to fully and successfully resolve the contradictions back then. But of course, what makes them wrong is that they're actually coming from the same class that conditions those contradictions. I mean, for example, in the case of Duterte, he's supported by big business personalities, especially from Mindanao, who today are enjoying the benefits of his political power. So their discontent, towards EDSA is basically just a rhetoric, to somehow paint a picture of how radical perhaps their alternative is. But whether they're authentic or not, of course, we know that they're not, because again, as I've mentioned, they're basically just coming from the same class that sets the conditions for the same exploitation and oppression that has been present in our society for years already.
Thank you, sir. Next question po tayo, unless may follow-up po si Mixnat. One
No
question
follow-up na po. Thank you.
Sige po, go.
Hindi, okay na po. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Another question, sir. There has been an increase over the past century of liberation theologians who are Marxists, or at least who identify as Marxists. But of course, since they are theologians and they're theists, many Marxists would argue that they are not materialists and so shouldn't be considered Marxists. So, ano pong pagtanaw natin doon?
Yeah. I forgot the title of that work. I think it's Sophism, Christianity, written by Jose Maria Sison, where he discussed the three main traditions, here in the Philippines, and Christianity actually and Marxism are among the three that he mentioned. So basically, there's an obvious opposition or contradiction between the principles that Christianity and Marxism believes, and whether these liberation theologians could be considered as Marxists, given that they believe in a God, and such a belief is in principle contrary to dialectical materialism, a basic tenet of Marxism, is a question which I think would depend on the person concerned. I can't really say whether they are Marxists or not, because in their practice, perhaps they might be called Marxists, but in theory it's far too different. Again, as I've mentioned, they reject a core tenet of Marxism. So, and but there are actually some liberation theologians who would claim that they are Marxists, or at least that they're influenced by Marxism. That's why their method is materialist, in the sense that they study the very material conditions that the people of God are subjected to. So they in this case, their being Marxism is attested, or is manifested through their method of inquiry, or their method of research, where they placed priority on the material conditions, understand, investigate, analyze the material conditions first, in order to be able to draw up a more relevant theology that answers the questions that the exploited people have been raising. So in that case, they could be Marxists. And again, as I've mentioned, some explicitly proclaim themselves as Marxists. Okay. So I guess that's the answer to the question.
Thank you po. Susunod na tanong po. Bilang galing po ito sa lecture po last time kay Sir JMP. pero applicable pa rin po, and I think it was directed to all of the speakers. So, ang sabi po dito, bilang ang Marxismo ay nakabatay sa materialistang pananaw, malaki ang pagkilala nito sa agham. Kinikilala nito ang materialismong dialektiko bilang ang pinaka-scientificong paraan upang suriin ang daigdig. Ano po ang ugnayan ng filosofiya at agham sa isang Marxista at ano po ang lugar ng dalawa sa sosyalista o komunistang lipunan?
The relationship of philosophy and science. No? Althusser actually had a discussion on that and claimed that it's actually philosophy that that comes first, no? before science. Basically, philosophy clears thought so that a new science would be able to develop. But as JNP mentioned, no, in his talk, no, that's actually the limitation of philosophy, because it's basically just its role is basically just to interpret the world, no, the logical clarification of thought, the thinking of thought. And I think where philosophy ends, science begins. No? So in changing the world, you have this time a science that should be able to guide you. So for Althusser, if Marxist philosophy came first in the form of dialectical materialism, but it's actually through dialectical materialism that the science of history was articulated. No? And what is that science of history? You have historical materialism. So their relationship is that one basically sets the condition for the other, so that you cannot actually ignore one for the other. They both must be taken into account, but their scope, no, and limitations must also be considered. No? For example, in the case of philosophy, because again, philosophy, and I also agree with what JMP said, that it basically is limited, no, in the theory, the interpretation of the world, and it's already up to science that the changing of the world should take place or should happen. So what are their roles in a socialist and communist society? Well, I believe that all the more should we pursue philosophical and scientific thinking in the socialist and communist society. I mean, for example, if people would have more leisure time, you know, as they are liberated from wage slavery, then people would have more time or there would be more people to do philosophy, and people would have more time doing philosophy. So I guess that's the time when when the conditions for what philosophy is flourishing would be set up, no? And that's also the contention of Alain Badiou, no? I guess in his work The Republic, no, his hyper translation of Plato's The Republic, where he asserted that the end goal is really to make all workers philosophers, no? Or to make all the working people philosophers, so that philosophy this time would not be limited to an elite group of people, the philosopher kings, who are destined, no, because of their golden souls, to think philosophy. But this time, because of the conditions set by socialism or communism, everyone is provided, no, or provided with the conditions to do philosophy.
Thank you, sir. I-open pa po natin. Again, kung gusto niyo pong magtanong, pwede pong mag-open ng microphone. Magtaas lang po muna ng kamay. O kaya ilagay po natin dito sa chat yung ating mga tanong. Maraming salamat po. Ito po, meron pa po tayong ilang tanong, sir. Ayon sa materialismong dialektiko, internal ang mapagpasya, ng internal na kontradiksyon ng siyang magiging sanhi upang umunlad ang isang entidad. Sa isang sitwasyon o kontradiksyon, paano natin scientificong sinusuri kung ano ang internal at external? Sir, nakamute po kayo.
Sorry. So I'll just give an example, no, on how, for example, we wage mass campaigns and struggles inside the university. So in waging mass campaigns and struggles, of course, we take into account the issue, and then who are those affected by the issue. No? So for example, the issue of budget cuts. Now, of course, that basically affects all of the UP constituencies. In that case, the internal factors in waging mass campaigns and struggles against budget cuts are really those who are affected, no, by the said budget cut. No? So you have the faculty, the reps, the admin staff, the students. So you have to design a mass campaign that would arouse, organize, and mobilize these people, no, these elements or these sectors, and that's because they're internally affected, no, by the said issue, and the resolution of that issue would only be made possible if if these sectors, these elements are also properly organized and mobilized. No? So what could be the external factors to this, no, in these mass campaigns? Perhaps, no, the support of the communities around UP could become an important external cause for this mass campaign, or the support from other universities could be an important but if a mass campaign or struggle is absent in UP itself, or from within UP itself, meaning from among faculty, students, and all the sectors, and only, for example, support or mass campaigns from other universities are present, then that would be we would be placed in a very difficult situation, no? Because it would appear that even the constituency is not really concerned, no, with the said issue, but only outsiders, no, who are not directly affected by the issue. So that's how I think we should grasp scientifically what's internal and external, and the question of who really is directly affected by the issues concerned.
Maraming salamat po, sir. Kung wala na pong ibang magsisend ng tanong, meron na lang pong isang huling tanong para po sa atin. Sabi niyo po, ano yung mga babasahin na marerekomenda nyo para sa baguhan sa Marxismo o di kaya sa dialectical materialism na hindi po masyadong mabigat para sa baguhan, para mas maintindihan po yung mga natalakay natin going forward?
Yeah, actually, the work by Joseph Stalin, Dialectical Materialism and Historical Materialism, is not a very difficult read, no? So it's digestible, no? And you can access it online. A lot of versions are actually available online. Actually, the three works that we discussed tonight, no? So you have that of Stalin, and then the two works of Mao on practice and on contradiction. So they are not very complex, no, they're not very difficult to read. So I suggest you could actually read those works to introduce yourselves to dialectical materialism.
Yun lang po, sir. Tapos na po ang ating open forum. Kung meron pa pong ibang tanong, pwedeng pong i-email sa amin sa Apeiron at tignan po natin kung magagawa natin ng paraan. Pero yun po, sa pagtatapos ng ating lecture para sa araw na to, gusto po naming magpasalamat sa inyo. Dr. Imbong, maraming salamat po sa aming imbitasyon. Nakakatuwa po na napagbigyan kami at napakarami po naming natutunan ngayong araw. Gayon din, gusto din naming magpasalamat sa lahat ng ating partner organizations na nakatulong sa lecture series na ito. Ang Philosophy Month 2022 ay hatid sa inyo ng Bicol University Young Philosophers Society, League of Filipino Students TSSP, UP Kabataang Pilosopo Tasio, at Hilagyo, the University of Santo Tomas Senior High School Philosophy Club. Hatid din ito sa pakikipagtulungan sa La Societe de La Salle University Senior High School Philosophy Club, Philippine Collegian, Philosophical Society of Philippine Normal University Manila, at UP Philosophy for Children Society.